but it's coming from the Highgate region of North London, and the information concerns the activities of SOE Circuits in France.
Tous ceux qui aiment le cinéma
en France
et dans le monde
sont avec vous.
What was calls you made? B of A, France. B of A, France, Switzerland.
A big boat, a house in France.
Actually, the only girl I ever knew who studied in France stayed over there and got married.
Air France 001, leaves today to first class.
100. All calls will be kept confidential.
France is very nice.
All passengers arrive from France. This train for London.
All right, since I'm in France and this is the last stop of my book tour, yes.
A good soft pillow for that good white head were better than a churlish turf of France.
Du fait de ces 7 années de conflit avec l'Algérie, la France se retrouve entraînée dans un état de trouble.
It is not a fashion for the maids in France to kiss before they are married, would you say?
By the which marriage the line of Charles the Great was reunited to the crown of France.
Because the president wants you to not only impose income tax in Monaco, but to pay the proceeds to France.
Yeah? Oh, been doing you better, have you? France.
No, joined too late.
Must keep your eye fixed on our duty. To defeat France.
Brussels fell to our forces yesterday, and airborne troops have secured the border with France.
Bill France Sr. conceived NASCAR in 1947 during a meeting in Daytona, Florida.
We will soon find the King of France a useful ally against the Scots.
But in loving me, you should love the friend of France. For I love France so well that I will not part with a village of it.
But remember, if there are any complaints in France, the customer is always wrong.
But see, thy fault France hath in thee found out.
By all that I've won, by all that I've written to spread the spirit of France.
A tremendous battle is raging in France and Flanders.
But I cannot break the term of the surrender and sully the lilies of France.
Can you identify the prisoner as your fellow traveller returning from France?
Big Bertha shelling France!
My old friend, now Chief Prosecutor of France, doesn't gain from this life. But who does?
Audrey's gone to Cynthia's in Connecticut for the weekend. And then on Wednesday she flies back to France.
And in France, the Germans advanced along the Saint-Michel salient, taking in the town of Saint-Romel and Toulon.
And Kate, when France is mine and I am yours, then yours is France and you are mine.
A name that I detest for all that it stands for in France.
And by their hands, this grace of kings must die ere he takes ship for France.
American champions arrive in France.
And from France, John Dupont!
And if he be not fought withal, my lord, let us not live in France.
Under Portugal, then Spain, France, Italy, who knows?
Now listen, kids. France is world famous for its cuisine, so just about anything's gonna be great.
France? But that's the front.
France does not give in to threats.
France. Frank's mother said the name of a village in France.
France.
Yeah.
France, Europe, Germany.
France.
France.
France indeed.
France is stuck in a terrible war in Algeria, Your Highness.
Fought a most brave battle here in France.
Big Trans Am in the driveway with a ribbon around it, and some incredibly gorgeous guy that you meet like in France.
As bride for his son, Longshanks had chosen the daughter of his rival, the King of France.
As we slogged through the hedgerows and across France, the sergeant began keeping to himself.
As you know, the Home Guard have been asked for cuts to help with the big push into France.
At least we're still in France.
They got this DDC in France supposed to keep the healthy cells you got from getting the HIV.
I'm going to go rails his tanks from Monte Carlo. We'd have lost everything to France.
Any country you want, I'll even put France on the table.
A promising virus has been discovered in France.
And sails back to France.
And they will give their bodies to the lust of English youth to new store France with bastard warriors.
I'd full tilt for Dover, and there embark for France.
And I should add that I would hate for you to think that France is easy.
And this spear lily from the south of France.
Now Mommy wakes up every morning
wishes she was in France.
And you bugger off to the south of France.
Come, I will bestow a breakfast to make you friends, and we'll be all three sworn brothers to France.
Of course, I can't say I've seen London, and I never been to France, and I ain't never seen no queen in her damn Dundies, as the fella says.
Cuisine in France is a secret society with no secrets.
Because I was saving up to take you to France.
What's France like?
France is very beautiful.
There are cases pending against countries such as Japan and France.
I can't go to France tomorrow.
Come to France.
France.
France, Signora.
For the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are of all most select and generous, chief in that.
For we have now no thought in us but France, save those to God that run before our business.
France.
For I have made an offer to His Majesty as touching France.
France.
This year's nominated actors and actresses come from France, England, Mexico, Northern Ireland, Argentina, Canada, Sweden, and the United States.
Finally, this froggy steps up, shouts, "Vive la France!" and leaps out.
There blows the wind for France.
France.
France. Comes France 49. Broke the strikes.
France, actually, tomorrow.
Give.
Sake, he'd better stay out of France.
France must be saved.
From France.
Furthermore, once France falls, Germany can concentrate on aircraft production.
France was worse.
Yeah, never liked that place much myself.
Gaveston, unless thou be reclaimed, thou shalt back to France.
That's your enemy.
Georges did not heed their warning, and for a while it seemed that he and Chitza might lead a happy life together in France.
God, I don't think France has been the same since I gave up absinthe.
Good. Your loyalty to France won't go without reward, Joshua.
France, probably.
God, you better not be this uptight in France.
Gaveston, unless thou be reclaimed, thou shalt back to France.
France is your natural destiny.
Generals' reputations are being made in France today, fighting on the Western Front.
He is protecting the Bank of France.
You have a secret fiancé in France. That's what everyone thinks.
France will soon follow suit.
Did you not see this man confer with two other men aboard the packet when you returned from France?
You love France.
Extradition between France and the United States is a bureaucratic nightmare, you know that?
I did. Elizabeth, save for Poland for France!
Did you know that was the Romans who started winemaking in France?
Donc, votre et France, vous et mien.
Oh, don't forget you're coming down to France.
Well, she's from France, you remember?
He loved England. He lived in France.
He is on his yacht, the Jolly Roger, in the south of France. Would have...
Horner reportedly left the country with a woman 20 years his junior and headed off to the south of France.
Henry VI, in infant bands crowned King of France and England, did this king succeed.
Heretofore, Charles St. Evremond of
was taken to a small town in the south of France called Berzier.
Hey, in France, we hit the beach right after D-Day.
So he's on one of these serious Tour de France.
He was recruiting for Fatah France.
How could you fall in love with an enemy of our France?
He would wait before he said Texas till after everybody thought he was talking about Paris, France.
He owns half of France, then.
Yeah.
He's one of the first colored soldiers in France.
Hey, Jack, this is Sona. She's an American who grew up in France, which makes her really friendly.
He rules England the way the Cardinal rules France.
His affairs in France keep him long overdue.
And His Excellency, the President of France, in his wife.
I'm going to France. My plane leaves in 1 hour.
How are things in France? I haven't heard from you yet.
I don't know when he'll be back.
France.
If invasion is imminent, if our troops in France are lost, they must be prepared.
Nothing. If France is going to drain Monaco of all she has, it's not unreasonable to expect French businesses to pay for it.
No,
If they want you to run the resistance in France on D-Day, you should know they wouldn't just call you in for a job interview.
I have friends in France.
I have witnesses in this courtroom today who saw the prisoner on a trip from France 9 months ago.
I heard the word in France, where I was fighting to expand your future.
I fought with him in France at Belleau Wood. He was my captain.
If I was you, sir, I wouldn't put one foot on France at this moment.
However, a cable to France revealed a rather unique fact about the real Miss Giles.
I brought it back in pieces from France.
Paris, France, and Central America, and you're behaving like you're still in some hamlet in the woods.
If we do not defeat them in France, we'll be fighting them in the streets of London, then New York, then Tokyo.
If you were truly guilty, there are 100 prisons in France where they would lock you away.
I got that good cheese from France.
Good. In fact, God is never in France this time of year.
In France? In Italy? Germany? America?
In France, they call that artistic.
We're in France, for Christ's sakes.
In 18th century France, there lived a man who was one of the most gifted and notorious personages of his time.
In France, is it actually illegal to shag your own cousin?
In France, it's always the landowner who makes the wine.
In the morning, I depart for France to press our rights.
In France the day before he died.
In fact, I strongly recommend we stop sending our precious fighter planes to be wasted in France.
In the name of God.
In France, correct?
In France, he is hailed as Le Lézard.
In unprecedented numbers, demonstrators are surrounding the National Bank of France.
I'm a traitor to France.
I mean, we seriously entertain going down to the south of France.
In France, all that matters to a chef is the Michelin stars.
I'm setting sail for France on the 15th from my moorings in Paddington to make the tides.
In France and other countries, children drink small amounts of wine all the time.
In the presence of this tribunal, which is the representative of human justice, before you, gentlemen of the jury, before France, before the whole world,
I must ask you, why in the name of heaven and hell did you ever come back to France?
I paid off my student loans, bought him a house in France.
I'm not claiming the greatest no Paris, France or nothing, but we do got 2 gas stations. Got us a Winn-Dixie, got us cable TV.
I might go to France, I might go to London.
In the streets closest to the ocean, you might think you were in the south of France.
I regret to say that France is already lost to me now.
I saved my brother's life over there, in France.
I reckon the Suster lands up in France after an all-night shagathon.
I see London. I see France.
Is France lost?
Well, I know, but he's in France.
I'm leaving France.
In fact, after France, the idea of a little time alone, I welcome it.
Bank in France froze customers' money market accounts today. Well, it's already 7:30 in the morning in France, so you better get started.
I suppose you can take them to France, too?
I spit on you! France spits on you!
I was thinking of going over, though not necessarily to Grenoble, but to France or Italy.
I want to live in France.
Kaiser, you patched me up behind that tank in France.
Now, it's my understanding you were educated in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Paris, France.
Last, and as much containing as all these, her brother is in secret come from France, feeds on this wonder, keeps himself in cloud.
Lawyers from France, engineers from Germany, architects from Holland, and now, of course, warriors from America.
Leave for France Thursday. Charing Cross. 1:30.
is it possible that I should love the enemy of France?
It is not possible that you should love the enemy of France, Kate.
Les bonnets présents. Marseille, France. Murder.
Les dames et demoiselles vont être baisées devant leur noces. Il n'est pas la coutume de France.
I should be going to France with the rest of them.
I thought you were in France with some sort of woman.
I will be the judge of what is best for me and for France.
Je prends sur la possession de France.
I was supposed to die in France.
I sold you a ceramic pig once at Maison France on Blicker.
I think that France has been ruled too long by tyrants.
I would advise you to live in some country, France, Italy, where homosexuality is no.
And I turned to my buddies and I said,
I will not leave France without... It's the closest, besides occupied France.
I mean, is there any point in working towards an examination if you're going to fall in love and set off to the south of France?
Je pensais que la France ne le lâcherait jamais.
It's Edmond Fallot, the best in France.
I was not angry since I came to France until this
Jerry can have France and Belgium and whatever else they want.
I want to get well inside France.
Je ne voudrais prononcer ces mots devant les seigneurs de France pour tout le monde.
Yeah, I think it did. Now in France, they say the word stick like this.
John Barsad, alias Guillermin, who once worked for the noble lords of France.
Is the president of France able to order murg masala with cashew nuts and cardamom? And
or maybe in France.
Okay, anybody?
In America, you have to.
My dread lord, your leave and favor to return to France, from whence, though willingly, I came to Denmark to show my duty in your coronation.
No, indeed, I shall have to go to France myself.
Michael and I have flown from the south of France to Paris, but we've never driven.
My duty to you both, on equal love, great kings of France and England.
Going to France.
Going.
Mr. Laurie left for France over 3 weeks ago.
Let's sell the car and move to France.
I mean, you didn't have anything to do with that bombing in France, right?
Mrs. Mills, our father's fighting in a war in France.
My mother left us. She went back to France.
Never king of England had nobles richer and more loyal subjects whose hearts have left their bodies here in England and lie pavilioned in the fields of France.
Mrs. Maynard, France is a good student. She makes A's and B's. Teen parents know her situation. They're okay with it. And all they're saying is they're...
More rats than in frickin' France.
New lands mean new taxes, and they're already taxed for the war.
I used to work for her in France.
Oh, half the aristocrats in France have liaison with their cousins.
My learned lord, we pray you to proceed and justly and religiously unfold why the law Salic that they have in France.
Listen up, class. April 4th, 1357, Castleguard, France.
It's like France.
No, I'd say quick run up through France and then over the drink.
No, like, let's move to France or some other country that hates Americans.
No next of kin. Still living in France.
Nothing between you and France.
This was your garden.
Nothing wrong with living in France.
My Minotaur tells me she is in Paris, France.
90% of them relocated from France.
No hospital in France.
No king of England is not king of France.
I'm going to France.
Look, where the sister of the King of France sits wringing of her hands, beats her breast.
Longley's Clipper, Farley's Gym Palace. Anyone with a pleasure craft bigger than 30 foot that can get to France.
Our food, our water, our power, everything runs through France.
Our thankfulness at the escape of our army must not blind us to the fact that what has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster.
On the way, I'll show you the best market in all of France.
Parachuted into France on D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Paris, France.
And by God's help and yours, the noble sinews of our power, France being ours, will bend it to our oar.
Paul has been appointed Cultural Affairs Commissioner for the south of France.
News from France. That's all.
Oh, well then we drive to France.
Now, lords, for France.
Perhaps we in Spain cannot claim the eminence of France, but the good Lord has seen fit to bless us with a miracle.
Very much, the largest magazine in France.
My name is Paul.
Perhaps I will, because I have family in France.
Peace with England and peace with France.
Only a very small part of that splendid army has yet been heavily engaged, and only a very small part of France.
Please comfort yourself with this as you leave for France.
Now he organizes for Fatah in France.
Reminds me of how Artie Gittins looked in his uniform when we went to France.
It'll be enough to remind you all that France is our enemy.
Someone in France doesn't matter.
Cheered voices. Stop being a peasant. Be a soldier. France needs you.
Since he went into France, I have been in continual practice.
Protesters in Libya, Bosnia, France, Moscow, and the United States are joining together to denounce this blatant act of
Simmons
terrorism.
is the best. Slowly work my way down through France to the Camargue.
That is not be the fashion for the ladies of France. I cannot tell what is based on English.
Also, France, 70 million. Germany, 500 million. Brazil, 2 billion.
South to Rue de Belgique, stationary Place de France. So do the kings of France unto this.
Sir, from Lord Gort in France, sir.
6th in France, 4th in Britain, and 3rd in Holland.
Remember that time you and I and Larry and Julie were on that eating tour of France?
Peace should not, in this best garden of the world, our fertile France, put up her lovely visage.
Sarah.
Wine from France?
Good try.
La prego di aspettare, per favore.
Difendere Monaco significa dichiarare guerra alla Francia.
Well, right before the occupation, when the Germans were just across the water in France.
Anyway, Ray was eating one of his company men's homes in...
Prime Minister, the situation in France.
She went to France.
France? She lives in France.
Skip Bale fled the country, entered France on a tourist visa.
There's this new drug in France.
South of France, buddy. Fancy hotel. You'll love it.
So what are you saving up for, Hawaii? South of France? Spaniards from near the border with France.
Shut up. Be there. Trust me. We're in 1357.
That never war advance his bleeding sword twixt England and fair France. That's near France, eh?
That's why we're moving to France.
That would be difficult considering the treaty never left France.
Right. I've got your address in France, so I'll write to you every day.
Thanks to our winged friends, every mercenary and bounty hunter in France will be waiting for them.
The Allies cross into France in 48 hours.
The presidents of Iran, Russia, Israel, and France have all agreed to your terms.
The situation in France, hopeless.
The boy is beginning to believe that he should rule France instead of me.
It means the camera was taking photographs of a wilderness near Castleguard, France in the year 1357.
A force of our armies from France will land here to the north of Edinburgh.
There had already been several attempts on de Gaulle's life in France.
The erotic intensity of the shared bed, that magic we give.
Therefore, I say, 'tis meet we all go forth to view the sick and feeble parts of France.
The only flying I ever did as a kid was in the family station wagon. It wasn't to France.
This book was published in France without permission of the Writers' Union.
Non, mais et puis c'est quoi les petits frères qui viennent ici en France, ils respectent plus les gens?
Might of the UDF, invading from France, the Mediterranean, Scandinavia, relieving pressure on the Eastern Front, allowing the Russians and Chinese to push the enemy back.
The German army has fanned out across Europe. From Poland to Serbia, Lithuania to Denmark, Norway to France.
The prisoner has been passing and repassing from France to England on secret business of which he can give no good account.
There's 2 sailings to France in June and 1 in July.
What? There is no bar to make against your Highness' claim to France, but this, which they produce from Pharamond.
1918, the first U.S. soldiers decorated for bravery in France are Negroes, Henry Johnson, and Needham Roberts.
The French were trying to push the English out of France for 100 years.
The President of France dines there.
The war with France.
The savior of France lost to us.
The white units have already rotated out to France. Why haven't we? Punched through the Ardennes into France.
Then France, then Belgium. Now I'm killing Germans in Germany.
The people aren't so afraid now the war with France is being won.
Bombing in France, the boss, all of it.
The cargo will then be unloaded onto a second ship carrying the American flag and set sail for France.
Finest toy maker in France.
The King of France dies at the hands of his own personal guard.
The King of France got a soft clap.
Then doth it well appear this Salic law was not devised for the realm of France, nor did the French possess the Salic.
How am I supposed to shave in France?
Grow a goatee.
Switzerland can be starter and France can be main course.
The situation in France gets worse every day.
We're on a milk run to France.
I hope so.
The south of France for the summer holidays.
slamming it.
The 3rd Canadian Division had penetrated deeper into France than the British or American troops.
They've been doing this for eons in France. This is real culture.
They've got great food in France.
And they're trying to make a quick beeline for France.
Think you not that the powers we bear with us will cut their passage through the force of France?
The Western Front in France is 400 miles long from the Alps to the North Sea.
This is America, not France. Okay?
This is for France.
This butter from Brittany is the best we have in France.
It's French. You gotta have French fries.
This is the Lancet Medical Review, and they published a study conducted in France. And it proves that AZT alone is too toxic for most to tolerate.
This is the best in France.
Those fields in France, they'll look like this now, won't they?
Top graduate from Princeton University, also holding advanced degrees from Columbia University and the Sorbonne University in Paris, France.
2 of these brothers walked out of the desert 150 years after having found the Grail and began the long journey back to France, but only one of them made it.
Schreiben Sie dies ab und lassen Sie es nach Berlin schicken. She's from France.
South of France for 2 weeks? France.
Cherry. Tiger's asked me to go to France with his mob.
This war. One best foreign novel in France.
Unfortunately, due to the bombing, the crossing between France and Germany is to be closed.
I love you.
Si ces voleurs du trésor ne mettent pas fin à leurs agissements, nous établirons un blocus économique et nous n'hésiterons pas à réclamer Monaco pour la France.
And to our brother France, health and fair time of day.
Up to France, should get to Paris 5, 6 in the morning.
We are in the heart of France.
Vive la France.
Vive la France.
We fought in France and the French fucking hate us.
Friends, we must have France to...
We're not out of France as yet.
We shall fight in France.
What can you study in France that you can't study here?
What do you say to her being slipped some crushed up sleeping pills, popped in a trunk, given to some smugglers and dumped in France?
When I got back from France and set foot in Clark County and saw what your cousin Bill Davis had done at his family's ranch.
So distant, so divine, and the chief of counterintelligence for all France.
Lost France! When we have matched our rackets to these balls, we will in France, by God's grace, play a set.
Which Salic land the French unjustly glows to be the realm of France.
Who hath sent thee now?
The Constable of...
Well, I'm 18. I leave Australia.
From Italy, where you from?
I'm proud
France,
to be... No,
you French now?
We're eating tour of France together.
We got France, we got Poland, we got a big Swiss bank account.
Well, that's a rather dangerous word with all your liberal colleagues in France.
Which is exactly why the celebration must be held. To show the world that the King of France can face an enemy on any field.
Whose state so many had the managing, that they lost France.
Why? Because we're in France.
Where did you find this guy? He's from France.
Why do flowers smell so much better in France than they do in the U.S.?
On s'est battu toutes ces années et tant de gens sont morts. Maintenant, les Allemands sont de nouveau en France.
Well known and celebrated in his native France.
What time is it in France?
Welsh bowmen, troops from France, Irish...
We shall fight in France.
If we got caught later, France wouldn't extradite us.
We've got enough petrol to get to France, haven't we?
We'll go to France, Spain.
So if this is France, I'm home, huh?
Come on, let's go.
We know we left the Grand Hotel in Marseille, took an Air France to Heathrow.
We're fixing to invade France.
Well, you got to go to France your junior year of college, and Shelby had those 2 months when she went missing in Mexico.
You should go to China.
I'm going to France.
Yes, Paris, France.
You think so? Are we in 1357 France?
You told me you weren't going to France yet.
You told me you were smuggled out of France by Marianne Beauséjour.
You don't have to shower in France.
Let God before tell him we will come on, though France himself and such another neighbor stand in our way.
You have the true soul of France.
Why do you stay so long, my lords of France?
Yeah, there's only one Paris in France, right?
You know, if we can get you to an ally country, Italy or
Spain or France.
You can't drive to France, Walter.
Yeah, it's way too far.
Do you know the McAllisters are going to France?
Would when I left sweet France and was embarked.
Yet now I must confess, that duty done, my thoughts and wishes bend again towards France and bow them to your gracious leave and pardon.
You're driving across France with Jacques, and you didn't call me?
You're the last person I'd expect to find in France. Why have you returned to France?
Yes. Question, you met your husband during the war? Answer, yes, I lived in a very small village in France, the kind of place where they never heard of Sarah Lee.
Tell me you wrote down the name of the village, Mr. Fox.
Your father and I thought yours would bring Austria and France closer together.
Yeah, they just got back to Europe over there for 2 months out in France, man.
Yes. When in France.
You didn't go to France, did you?
Your sister made a deal with France to deliver Monaco.
You know, in France, they have the different sort of electrical cards and the thing just blows up.
Yeah, I lived in a very small village in France, Montrichard.
You know, my name is quite common in France, and unfortunately, someone using the same name has been charging on false cards.
Yeah, I was gonna take you to France.
With these papers, I relinquish all of my property and my titles here in France.
You're not leaving France.
You probably get the kind of traveler's checks that don't work in France.
Ellen was in France.
You know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in France?
Your Highness, lately sending into France, did claim some certain dukedoms and the right of your great predecessor, King Edward III.
Zeus satellites 2, 3, 5, and 6 are locked on target. France.
You will pay the proceeds to France. You want us to pay tax to France?